The sea was touching the walls of the castle, so smaller boats were brought closer just to take the captives into the ship, which docked far away on the sea. Through this small door, millions of Africans were taken away. Slavery in Elmina Castle lasted for about 400 years.
Wow.
So according to history, millions of Africans were taken. 1/3 survived, and 2/3 died.
And that is ones here, correct?
Once here.
So not counting the
Not
ones.
even talking from the forest, not talking of the middle passage. Just
You have a 32% chance of surviving this.
1/3.
Is the door open?
Hence there were some small the sea was
You say the sea, the water line was further in?
yeah, when it was on the high tide.
When is that high tide?
Oh, wait, until everything
So
else.
high tide was important.
Did everyone get a look out the door of no return?
Not yet.
Please step back so the others can get a chance to come up to the door. So everybody gets a chance. Thank you.
So does the
Door of no return.
the trade only happen a certain time of the year?
Year round. Trading. People were coming in, people were going, coming in, people were going.
What's the difference between high tide and low tide?
Really, it depends on the time that the ice gets melted, and then you just see kind of more closer to the castle.
That's not the original.
Maybe when you have hot weather, is the ice.
Is that the original door? No.
No, please, we've changed it.
There are no
It's not
doors.
But it looks like that.
Yes, to this one.
Watch it second.
So it was open, so they got air here too.
Yeah, it was locked, but when they got here, it was open.
But the water was right there.
Yeah.
Look at the lock.
You said that the water level came
Yeah, mostly during the high tide,
high
they
tide.
do come closer. But now, because of the sea defenses and other things, it doesn't count.
This here, so this is not the original.
Yeah, this is
ledge?
not original because of the drainage part thing, so that when it's rain, the water will flow down. So this.
Oh, this is a drainage, because they wouldn't have that.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. And they were always chained?
They were always changed, even in the dungeons as well.
So
So they were not afraid.
Portuguese
They weren't taking any chances.
versus the British versus anybody else, the Dutch, were they a more compassionate enslaver?
No.
More lenient, you should say. They were more lenient.
No,
That's an oxymoron.
They were more lenient.
No, the Portuguese were harsh. They were,
You know, for me to say, the Portuguese were here for 155 years, and out of the
Up to
100
400 years.
out of the
Before
400
it
years,
started.
the Dutch were here for 235 years, and all this period was for slavery.
Okay,
For the Dutch, 235, all was for slavery.
okay.
But the Portuguese, 155, they used part of it for slavery when the Dutch took over. And the English built Cape Coast Castle. You know, Cape Coast Castle was built by the English in the idea of slavery. So Cape Coast Castle was purposely built for slavery, which has a complete dungeons. But here was trading before extension.
I think Dell asked a fair question though. That was one group of Europeans more compassionate than another group? And I think there's a resounding no to that answer.
Thank you.
Because it's an oxymoron. That's like saying hot ice. There's no such thing as hot ice. So there's no such thing as compassionate slavery. We have been taught, at least I'm 57, so when I was in school, I remember being taught that there were good slave holders. Oh, he was a kind slave master. This one was a harsh slave master. There's no such animal. If you are treating people and viewing people as chattel, as less than human, there's no good slave master, no good slavery, kind, gentler slavery. Let's get that notion out of our heads forever.
Well, but I still think that there's a level of, there's a level of thinking about it at this time versus thinking about it at that time. And I think that it has some validity to say that maybe there was some less crazier white folk.
Okay, well, I think
so.
I can add to that, because if you think about it, okay, in the New World, which is the largest country that has the largest amount of African people outside of Nigeria? Which is Brazil. Okay, the Portuguese were the longest reigning slavers in the New World. Okay, they had the most slave colonies here in Africa. I mean, not just on the West Coast. They had Angola, they had Mozambique, other parts of East Africa. They was constantly in competition with the Arabs on that side of the continent, and here they was in competition with the English and the Dutch. So when it came to dealing with slaves, they were constantly bringing them in. Even after the slave trade was abolished in other countries, I think the British outlawed slavery in 1807.
1807, yeah.
1807, and then and the Portuguese, they kept going. Even though the British, they had the most powerful naval fleet in the world at that time, the Portuguese still kept dealing in slavery, and they didn't abolish slavery in Brazil till 1888. So you think that that's a good 70, 80 years that they kept going. So roughly 80% of the population in northeastern Brazil specifically has African blood in them. Now, and what Kat said is right. They really didn't care too much for their slaves because they had so many possessions in Africa and in the neighboring islands. So if one died, another 10 was getting off the ship probably that day. Whereas in North America, I'm not saying that our slave masters were kinder, but they were more likely to try to perpetuate us, keep us living, because the United States didn't have as many possessions. They had hardly any possessions in Africa. They always bought their slaves from a middleman. Exactly. And so, and it just goes to show you how European nations started treating their slaves. When you go back to Brazil, the Portuguese, the only thing they cared about was, will our slaves work for us? So once the work was done, they really didn't care what their slaves did. So they allowed them to keep their drums, and the only thing, they didn't want them to practice their own religion. So the slaves started disguising their rituals to lead the Portuguese to believe that they're worshiping Christian gods. Same thing in Cuba. The Spanish didn't care what their slaves did as long as they did their work, as long as they worshiped their gods. And when you think about it, that is exactly how the religion Santeria came into existence. They are the slaves. They had to disguise their gods with Christian faces. That's why if anyone knows anything about Santeria and the Orishas in Cuba, every Orisha has a Catholic or a Christian counterpart. So, but yeah, the Portuguese and the Spanish, they tried to perpetuate their slaves. I mean, they didn't care about their slaves as much, and because they had more possessions.
Let's put it this way. It was more profitable to work their slaves to death.
Exactly.
Because they could get a fresh body.
Exactly.
They worked them to death. Okay, they were not more compassionate. And you made a very good point about the United States. As opposed to working to death in terms of perpetuating, that's why you had breeding farms.
Exactly.
They had breeding farms. So they would force a man to have intercourse with a woman and to get the babies. They would force a son to have intercourse with his mother. That is where one source says the term MF comes from.
Yeah.
We don't even know that, and we're talking about MF. Okay, but that is one way of
The
thinking.
origin of the word.
Is the
Yeah,
origin, yes,
of the word
yes.
itself.
So breeding farms, Reynolds Tobacco Company.
Now, if anyone remember this boxing promoter, this was a couple decades ago. His name was Jimmy the Greek. He was, I don't think he meant anything by it at that time, but when he was talking about how our ancestors were bred with one another. And he wasn't saying to try to disparage us, but it was still disparaging nonetheless. He said he would say how the white slave master would intentionally get a big, strong African male and pair him up with a large African woman in order to have a strong African baby. So big men with big women, little men with little women, et cetera, et cetera. But it was always with the goal of producing a bigger and stronger African slave. So during the days of slavery, the more babies we had, that was more profit for them, more free labor for them. That's why when you think about it, the majority of African Americans when their families originated in the South, they had big families. My mother had 10 brothers and sisters. My father had 6 brothers and sisters. And it went on and on. But once they freed us, through force, through the Civil War, they didn't do it willingly, mind you. Once we were freed after the Civil War, we went from being free, cheap labor to now we're competitors. Okay, that's why I was saying before at the other castle, this when America was established by our former slave masters, it wasn't established with the intention of having us a part of their society. We was their cheap labor. America was built with the intention of being built on our backs. So anyway, that's it.
Okay, so please.
You won't forget what you said earlier.